I'm standing at the departures curb at Hartsfield-Jackson International in Atlanta, holding 2 suitcases and my son-in-law's blazer in a garment bag, and my daughter is already disappearing into traffic without so much as a wave or a backwards glance. It's 104 degrees, my shirt is soaked through, and I've got 5.5 hours before a flight I booked 3 weeks ago, thinking this trip was finally going to fix something that broke between us. I'm David Thornton. I'm 67 years old, and I've just realized in real time that everyone in my life who I thought I understood has been lying to me for quite a while. Not dramatically, not with shouting or confrontation, just quietly, systematically, the kind of lies that look like love from far away. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because I did. I stood there holding a stranger's blazer for nearly 45 minutes, trying to understand what had actually just happened. Here's the thing about being left at a curb: nobody tells you how small it makes you feel, even when you're 6 feet tall and you've spent 43 years in structural engineering. I spent my entire career looking at load-bearing systems, understanding the invisible forces that hold buildings together. I built bridges that people drove over without thinking twice about whether they'd collapse. I was good at my work. I was respected. And in that moment, standing alone in the Atlanta heat, I realized I'd spent 43 years understanding how to build structures to stand on their own, and exactly 0 years figuring out how to build a family that would do the same thing. That was starting to matter. My name might mean something to people who know about load calculations and moment diagrams, but let me give you the real biography first. I'm a widower. My wife Eleanor died 4 years ago this past March, and we'd been married for 31 years before that. We bought our house together in 1987 on Paces Ferry Road in northeast Atlanta, 3 blocks from the Virginia Highland District, the kind of neighborhood where people raised families and stayed put and built actual community. Eleanor and I raised one daughter there, Rebecca, and she left for Arizona when she was 22 years old and never really came back, not in any way that counted. I used to believe, the way you do when you're younger, that if you built something solid enough, that if you invested enough love and attention into something, it would hold. Buildings hold. Bridges hold. But people? I was about to learn something different about that. After Eleanor died, my life became very small and very quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, it's just empty. My daughter Rebecca would call on Sundays, and those calls became every other Sunday. And then those became text messages sent around 9 at night that said things like, "Thinking of you, Dad," with a heart emoji that I'd come to understand meant I'm acknowledging your existence, but I'm not interested in an actual conversation. I worked right up until 72 years old because staying home felt worse than staying busy. I worked at Mercer Engineering in downtown Atlanta, which I'd been at for 43 years, until I retired 5 years ago, and the office gave me a gift card and a plaque that I hung in my garage next to my tools. Then, in late August, Rebecca called me on a Tuesday afternoon. The call itself was unusual enough to make me sit down before I answered. "Dad," she said, her voice different than it had been in years. "I want you to come out for a long weekend in Labor Day. Just us. Claire's been asking about you, my granddaughter. She was 15 years old, and I hadn't seen her in 17 months. I had no idea what her asking about me even meant, but I booked a flight to Dallas that night. Southwest, from Hartsfield-Jackson to Dallas Love Field, seat 12C, $273 round trip. And I remember packing my bag feeling like Eleanor was doing this somehow, that she was nudging something loose in the universe just to get me out of the house. I flew out on a Friday afternoon. Rebecca picked me up at baggage claim wearing dark sunglasses and moving with an efficiency that suggested she had approximately 15 minutes to give me before she needed to be somewhere else. She hugged me the way you hug an acquaintance at your child's school fundraiser. Quick, performative, over before it started. "Where's Claire?" I asked. "She's got a thing," Rebecca said, which turned out to mean absolutely nothing because Claire was home for the entire weekend with nothing to do. She was confused about why nobody had brought her to the airport. The first 2 days were technically fine, though fine isn't the right word. It's like watching a movie, where all the dialogue is a half-second out of sync with the actor's lips. You know something's wrong, but you can't quite name it. Rebecca's husband Daniel is a developer. He does residential projects, high-end community planning, the kind of thing where his business card has a lot of words and says almost nothing real about what he actually does. Ashford Properties, the company's called. On Saturday night, he grilled expensive steaks and spent 45 minutes talking about a development project north of the city that he kept calling the crown jewel of his portfolio. He said it at least 3 times. The way someone says something when they're rehearsing it for an audience that isn't actually listening. Claire and I sat on the back patio on Sunday evening while everyone else was inside, and she showed me a robotics project she'd built for a school competition. It was a little wheeled machine that could navigate an obstacle course using sensors she'd written the code for herself. She explained torque ratios to me by flashlight so she could see her own circuit board, and I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in months. Here was someone who actually wanted me to be there. Someone who looked at me like I was a person worth explaining things to. I'm going to ask you to remember that moment, because it's important. Very important. It's the thing I held on to afterward. That Sunday night, after Claire went to bed, Daniel and Rebecca sat me down at their kitchen island with a manila folder and 2 glasses of wine I hadn't asked for. "This is important," Daniel said, sliding the folder toward me like a man presenting quarterly earnings to a board. "We need to talk about estate planning, protecting your house in Atlanta, making sure everything is clean and simple for when you pass. No probate headaches, no courts, nothing messy." I opened the folder. The document was titled Quitclaim Deed with Retained Life Estate. My address on Paces Ferry Road typed across the top, 2 blank signature lines below my name, one for Rebecca, one for Daniel. "This just adds us to the deed," Rebecca said too quickly, the way people talk when they've rehearsed the next 4 sentences in their head. "You keep living there. You keep everything. It just avoids probate when the time comes. It's standard. Everyone does this." My stomach did something unpleasant. "I want to be very clear about something," I said, "because people ask me this all the time. I wasn't offended by estate planning. I'm 67 years old and a widower. I know how these conversations are supposed to happen. I'd already had one with my attorney, Harold Bennett, who has an office on Riverside Drive, who'd drawn up a perfectly good will for me after Eleanor died. But this folder, this specific moment, this timing, a document notarized and ready, blank lines waiting for my signature, on a weekend when I happened to be 300 miles from my own lawyer, this felt different. "I'd like Harold to look at this first," I said. "That's all I'm asking. Just have him look at it." The temperature in that kitchen dropped about 20 degrees. "Dad, it's a standard form," Rebecca said, and her voice had changed. "You don't need a lawyer reviewing a standard form." "Then it won't take him long," I said. Craig's jaw did something small and tight that I pretended not to notice. "We were kind of hoping to get this squared away before you fly out tomorrow," he said. "There's a title window issue on our end, some financing timing. It's complicated, but it really needs to happen this week." Financing timing. I filed that phrase away like a piece of evidence. I didn't sign anything that night. I told them both I loved them, which I meant, and that I'd have Harold look at the documents Monday morning. Then I went to the guest room and lay awake until nearly 2 in the morning, listening to the low murmur of an argument happening 2 rooms away, the kind of sound that travels through houses when everyone thinks everyone else is asleep. I couldn't make out words, just tone. And tone, after 43 years, reading blueprints for invisible structural weaknesses, is something I've gotten very, very good at detecting. I knew that tone meant something was falling apart in that house. Monday morning, Rebecca was different. Cold in a way that wasn't rude exactly, just efficient, like I'd become a task on her to-do list instead of her father. She told me my flight had been moved up 2 hours due to a Southwest scheduling change. I found out later that was not true. My flight never changed. It left at 3:40 in the afternoon, exactly as originally booked, but I didn't know that yet. She told me we needed to leave by 11 in the morning instead of 1, so I scrambled to repack my bag. Claire came downstairs in her school uniform looking confused, saying, "Wait, Grandpa's leaving? I thought we were doing the robotics thing again today." Nobody answered her. The car ride to the airport took 18 minutes, and not a single word was spoken. I asked about Claire's fall soccer season and got one-word answers. When we pulled up to the departures curb at Terminal 4, Rebecca put the car in park, popped the trunk from inside without stepping out, and said exactly this. "Okay, this is you." I got out. I pulled my suitcase from the trunk. I reached back in for the garment bag with Daniel's blazer, which had somehow gotten tangled up with my things. I held it up and said, "Hey, isn't this Craig's?" That's when she said it. "Figure it out, Dad. I've got a lot going on right now." And she pulled away from the curb into 3 lanes of outgoing traffic at 11:20 in the morning, with a flight that didn't depart for 4.5 hours. I stood there checking myself for damage the way you do after you've been hit by something you didn't see coming. Skycaps moved around me. Families hauled matching luggage. Somewhere a car horn went off. Short and irritated. Let me stop right here. I know a lot of people who have heard this story have asked me, in the moment, how did you not rage? How did you not call and demand she come back? How did you accept that? I called Rebecca's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I texted her, "You forgot Craig's blazer." He left it with me. No response. I sat down on a concrete bench outside the terminal in the shade of an overhang, sweat soaking through my collar, and I did something I hadn't done in 4 years. I thought about calling Eleanor out of pure habit before I remembered that I couldn't. And that's when I heard my name. Walt. No. Wait. Not Walt. David. David Thornton. I looked up expecting a stranger. The way you do when someone says your name in a place where you don't know a single soul. A man in his mid-40s was walking toward me from the terminal doors, rolling a black carry-on, wearing a sport coat that fit like it cost more than my first car payment. He had the kind of face that takes you a second to place because your memory of it is 20 years younger. "James Kumar," he said, stopping in front of me. "You hired me in 2002. I was 23 years old, fresh out of community college, with a degree that was barely worth the paper it was printed on. Drafting table number 3, 3rd floor at Mercer Engineering. You put me by the window on purpose so the light would be good. You spent 2 years teaching me everything you knew about load calculations and structural safety. I left in 2008 for a job in Dallas, and I remember feeling terrified and grateful watching you wave goodbye. James Kumar." I actually said his name out loud, and I felt something in my chest I can only describe as relief. So profound it almost knocked me over. "My God," I said. "Look at you. What are you doing standing out here in this heat?" He actually looked at me then, really looked at me. The suitcases, the garment bag that clearly wasn't mine, whatever was showing on my face that I thought I was hiding. His expression shifted. "David, what's going on?" I didn't know it yet, but the next 90 minutes were going to change the direction of the rest of my life. I told him the short version because I didn't have the energy to dress it up. My daughter dropped me off nearly 5 hours early and drove away. He listened without interrupting, the way he used to listen when I explained sheer stress calculations to him at that drafting table 22 years ago. Patient. Absorbing. Occasionally nodding. "That's not okay, David," he said finally. "I don't care what's going on with her. That's not okay." "She's got a lot on her plate," I said, because after 67 years I still didn't know how to stop defending my own daughter. Even to a man who used to bring me coffee every single morning at 7:15, James didn't argue with me out loud. He just looked at me in a way that told me he didn't believe a single word. "Come on," he said. "I've got 3 hours before my flight to Denver. There's a place inside past security, with real chairs and air conditioning. You're going to sit down and tell me what's actually going on. And then I'm going to tell you why I've spent the last 2 months trying to track you down." That last part stopped me cold. Track me down? 2 months? We got through security together. James talking to a TSA supervisor he apparently knew to speed things along. We sat down at a little bar and grill near Gate B14 with 2 coffees and a plate of fries. Neither of us really wanted, but both of us needed something to do with our hands. That's where James Kumar told me something that took the entire weekend and turned it completely upside down. "I run a structural engineering firm now," he said. "Kumar Structural Solutions, based right here in Dallas. Satellite office in Denver, 84 employees. We do high-rise retrofits, seismic work, bridge consulting. I built it from nothing starting in 2013. "James," I said, "I had no idea. And I meant it completely. And something about saying it out loud made me feel very, very small in a way I didn't like. "David, I built this entire company on your training," he said quietly. "Every calculation method I teach my junior engineers, I learned from you at that drafting table. Every time I catch a mistake in a load path before it becomes a problem, that's your voice in my head, not any textbook. I've told that story in interviews. I've told it at conferences. 2 months ago, I got asked to speak at the National Structural Engineers Symposium in San Francisco this November. They wanted me to name someone who shaped my career for a lifetime achievement recognition. I gave them your name. I've had a researcher trying to track down your current contact for 2 months because Mercer doesn't exist anymore. It got absorbed into some larger firm in 2016, and nobody had a forwarding address for you. I sat there with a lukewarm cup of coffee halfway to my mouth and didn't say anything for a long moment. You're telling me, I said slowly, that while I was standing on that bench outside baggage claim wondering if my own daughter was ever going to answer her phone, you were sitting on a plane about to fly directly past me, and somehow we ended up in the same terminal on the same day? I'm telling you Eleanor would have called that something, James said quietly, and I realized he remembered her name. He remembered her from a company Christmas party more than 20 years ago, and something in my throat went tight enough that I had to look down at the fries for a second. We talked for almost 2 hours. James told me about the symposium, about the recognition, about wanting me there in November as his guest of honor, whether I said yes to anything else for the rest of my life or not. He also told me, very carefully, that he did some occasional forensic consulting work, expert witness testimony on structural failure cases, construction litigation. And somewhere in that conversation, he asked almost casually what had brought me to Dallas in the first place. So I told him about the folder, the quitclaim deed, the blank signature lines, the phrase financing timing. James went very quiet in a way that made my stomach move. David, he said carefully, Ashford Properties. Is that the development project north of Dallas? A community called Northbrook Reserve? Nearly 50 lots? Broke ground last spring? My stomach did something worse than move. It dropped. That's what Daniel called it, I said. The crown jewel. How do you know that? Because 2 of my former clients are investors in that project, James said. 3 weeks ago, I got a call asking if my firm would do an independent structural review because there's a lawsuit brewing. Serious allegations. Misrepresentation on engineering reports. Corners cut on soil compaction testing to save money and hit deadlines. The investors are asking for damages north of $4 million. I turned the job down because of a potential conflict. But David, that lawsuit is real. It's active. It's asking for serious money. I sat there in that airport bar and felt something shift under my feet. The way it does when you realize a beam you trusted has a hairline crack you never caught. $4 million. Financing timing. A quitclaim deed sitting ready with blank signature lines, produced on the exact weekend I happened to be visiting. Urgent enough that my flight supposedly needed to be moved up 2 hours for absolutely no reason at all. If you've ever been in a room where everything you thought was one thing suddenly revealed itself to be something completely different, you know that feeling. It's not anger at first. It's just incomprehension. It's your brain refusing to process the data you're receiving. I flew home that afternoon with James's business card in my shirt pocket and a knot in my stomach that didn't loosen for an entire week. I still had Daniel's blazer. I hung it in my hall closet when I got home, still on the hanger, and I looked at it for a long moment. Then I called my oldest friend, a man named Frank Mitchell. Frank and I go back to 1984, both 28 years old, both starting our first real jobs. Frank was in construction management. I was fresh out of Georgia Tech. He's retired now, lives 3 blocks away on the same street, been married to Patricia for 43 years. Patricia makes a pecan pie that should honestly be illegal. Frank is the kind of man who tells you the truth even when you'd rather he didn't. That night, sitting on my back porch with 2 beers neither of us finished, I needed exactly that kind of honesty. Frank, I said after telling him the whole thing. The folder. The airport. James. The lawsuit. You know what that document actually does if I sign it, right? Really? No. Tell me anyway. I want to hear you say it out loud. It puts Daniel's name on your house, Frank said. Joint tenancy. If that lawsuit goes the way James says it's going, and a judgment lands on Daniel personally, his creditors can come after any asset with his name attached to it, including a house in Atlanta that he's never paid a single dollar in property tax on in his life. They'd have been using my house as a shield, I said slowly, or as collateral, or both. Financing timing, Frank said, shaking his head. That's your financing timing right there. Daniel needs equity to cover legal exposure, or he needs your name and your credit to secure something before the lawsuit locks his own assets down. Either way, David, that folder wasn't about avoiding probate. It was about keeping Daniel's development company breathing for another 6 months, and your daughter helped put it in front of you. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about Claire on that patio, explaining torque ratios with a flashlight held between her teeth so she could see her own circuit board, and about how nobody in that house except her had asked me a single genuine question all weekend that wasn't leading somewhere else. The next morning I called Harold Bennett. His office is on Riverside Drive, 3rd floor, and he's handled my legal affairs since 1994. I drove over with the folder still in my carry-on and set it on his desk. Harold read it twice. Then he took his glasses off, set them down, and looked at me the way a man looks at you when he's about to say something he'd rather not have to. David, this isn't a simple estate planning document, he said. This is a quit-claim deed that converts sole ownership into joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. The moment you sign this, Rebecca and Daniel become legal co-owners of that house, effective immediately. Your retained life estate lets you keep living there. Sure, but it does not protect the property from claims against either of their names. If Daniel gets a judgment against him, and I'm understanding there may be one coming, a creditor absolutely can place a lien against his ownership interest in your house. You would have handed half your house to his lawsuit, Harold said carefully. You would have handed half your house to his legal exposure. And once Rebecca's name goes on that deed too, in a divorce, in a bankruptcy, in any legal proceeding involving either of them, this house stops being entirely yours to protect. I'm going to be honest with you, David. In 17 years of doing this work, I don't see documents like this show up by accident. Somebody who knows exactly what they're doing drafted this to look simple. It's not simple. I sat in that conference room for a long time looking out at the river moving past the window, thinking about Eleanor, thinking about how many times she used to say, "Rebecca has good instincts. David, let her be," wondering when exactly those good instincts had gotten overwritten by somebody else's desperation. I didn't call Rebecca that day. I didn't call her the next day either. I let 3 full days pass in complete silence. Silence is a decision. Every hour I didn't call was an hour I spent instead, with Harold, with Frank, and eventually with a private accountant named Priya Nair, whom Harold recommended, going through exactly what my financial footprint looked like inside Rebecca and Daniel's life. Because it turned out there was more than just the deed. I'd been paying Claire's private school tuition at Thornwood Academy for 3 years. $4,200 a semester, wired directly to the school. Something I'd offered to do gladly, and never once regretted because it was for Claire, not for them. I'd co-signed Rebecca and Daniel's auto loan on a Range Rover 2 years earlier, when Daniel's business credit wasn't strong enough to qualify. A detail I'd genuinely forgotten until Priya pulled the credit report. My name, my social security number, backing a car I'd never once ridden in, and buried in 3 years of bank statements, I found something I hadn't consciously tracked. A recurring transfer of $600 a month into an account labeled Rebecca Checking. Money I'd started sending after Eleanor died because Rebecca had called crying about how tight things were. And it had just quietly continued every month since on complete autopilot. The way grief makes you generous without asking many questions. Nearly $9,000 a year flowing out of my accounts into theirs on top of tuition on top of a car loan. And at the end of that visit, the thank you I'd received for 30-plus years of being their financial floor was a curb, 2 suitcases, and 4 words through an open car window. Here's what I need you to understand about that moment. When someone you love treats you like you're disposable, it doesn't hurt because you're wrong about them. It hurts because you're right. You've just been refusing to see it clearly until that moment forces you to. I called James on the 4th day, not about the deed, about the symposium in November. I told him yes, I'd be honored. And somewhere in that conversation, I mentioned almost in passing everything Harold and Priya had found. James went quiet again in that careful way. "David," he said, "I know a couple of the litigation attorneys representing the investors in that Northbrook Reserve lawsuit. Not intimately, but professionally. If you want, purely as a friend, I could make an introduction and you could understand exactly what kind of exposure Daniel's actually carrying before you decide anything about that house. I said yes. What came back through a very careful, very lawyerly phone call from one of the investor's attorneys 10 days later was significantly worse than I'd expected. The lawsuit alleged that Ashford Properties had submitted falsified soil compaction reports to move the Northbrook Reserve project through county permitting faster than the actual site conditions allowed, cutting costs on remediation work that should have cost close to $700,000. Cracks had already appeared in 3 completed foundations. The investors were seeking damages. Separately, the county was conducting its own review that could result in criminal referral if intentional falsification was proven. Daniel wasn't just facing a civil judgment, he was facing the possibility of fraud charges, and he had needed my house or my credit or both sometime in the next several weeks to keep the whole thing propped up long enough to either settle quietly or ride out the storm. I sat with all of that for 2 more days. Then I called Rebecca. She answered on the second ring, which surprised me. Her voice had that brittle brightness people use when they think they already know how a conversation is going to go. "Dad, hey, I've been meaning to call. Things have just been so crazy." "Rebecca," I said, keeping my voice level the way I used to keep it level in a boardroom, explaining to a client why a design change was going to cost them more money. "I need you to listen to me and not talk for a minute. Can you do that?" There was a pause. "Okay." I had Harold review the deed, I said. "I know what it actually does. I know it puts Daniel's name on my house, not just yours. I know about the Northbrook lawsuit. I know about the soil compaction allegations. I know roughly what kind of exposure Daniel is facing. And I know that document was drafted to move fast enough that it would have been notarized and recorded before that lawsuit ever touched his other assets." The silence on the other end went on long enough that I checked if the call had dropped. "Dad, it's not what you think." "I'm not finished," I said, still calm, still level. "I flew 300 miles to see you and Claire for a weekend. I was dropped at curbside departures 4.5 hours before my flight with your husband's Blazer and told to figure it out. That's the part I want you to sit with, Rebecca, not the deed, the curb." I heard her breathing change, something catching in it. "I love you," I said, and I meant every single word, the way I've meant it every day since you were a little girl and fell asleep against my shoulder in a second-hand rocking chair from a church sale on Peachtree Avenue. I have never once stopped loving you. But love isn't the same thing as being useful, Rebecca, and I think somewhere in the last few years, that's the only thing I've been to you and Daniel. Useful. That's not fair," she said, her voice cracking now. "Then tell me it's not true," I said. "Tell me the school tuition and the car loan and $600 a month I've been sending since Eleanor died and a quitclaim deed timed to a lawsuit you didn't think I'd find out about. Tell me none of that adds up to something. I'll believe you if you can say it and mean it." She didn't say it. She just cried quietly on the other end of a phone line stretching from Atlanta to Alpharetta. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I let the silence sit there instead of rushing in to fill it for her. "Here's what's going to happen," I said finally. "I'm not signing that deed. Not now. Not ever. I'm ending the automatic transfer effective this week. I'm removing myself from the Range Rover loan, which means you and Daniel are going to need to refinance it in his name alone within the timeline the lender gives you or sell it. Claire's tuition, I want to be very clear about this, is not going anywhere. That was never for you and Daniel. That was for her. It stays exactly as it is because that girl has never once asked me for anything except my time." "You're punishing us," Rebecca said. Something in her voice had shifted from crying into something harder, more defensive, more like the version of her that had told me to figure it out with the windows already rolling up. "No," I said. "I'm stopping. There's a difference. I spent 3 days waiting for you to call and explain yourself before I already had all the answers. That tells me everything I need to know about what this weekend actually was." I hung up before she could say anything else. I sat on my back porch for a long time in the dark, listening to the cicadas going in the trees along Pace's Ferry Road, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph. Not even anger. Not anymore. Just a strange, quiet clarity. The kind you feel when a structural report finally confirms what you already suspected was wrong with a building, and you can finally stop pretending the crack in the foundation is just cosmetic. 2 weeks later, Harold drew up an amended will. The house on Paces Ferry Road, along with the bulk of my retirement accounts, now sits in an irrevocable trust with one named beneficiary, Claire Renee Blake, to be administered until she turns 25, with provisions for her education fully funded regardless of anything happening in her parents' lives. Rebecca is named in the will, too. A modest sum, a gesture rather than an inheritance, because I couldn't bring myself to cut my own daughter out entirely. No matter what she'd done, Daniel's name appears nowhere in any of it. I also called Claire directly on her own cell phone, something I'd never done before because it always felt like going around her parents. I told her I wanted to keep doing the robotics thing whenever she wanted. Video calls, visits, whatever worked. I told her that nothing that happened between me and her mom and dad changed one single thing about how I felt about her. She was quiet for a second and then she said, "Grandpa, Mom's been weird for like a month. I didn't know why. I'm glad you're not mad at me." I told her I could never in 100 years be mad at her, and I meant every syllable. That's the part of this story you need to understand. That's the part that actually matters more than the lawsuit or the deed or any of it. Claire calls me now every Sunday evening, not because anyone tells her to, but because she wants to talk through her physics homework or show me a new coding project or complain about a teacher who doesn't explain torque properly. She's the loyal one in that family. She always was. I just hadn't been paying close enough attention to see it clearly until a curb in Dallas forced me to. If you have ever been in a family and felt like the only person actually showing up was someone a generation younger than you, someone who didn't owe you anything, you know exactly what I mean. That feeling of discovering that love isn't always where you expected to find it. November came, and I flew back to Dallas on my own terms this time, staying at a hotel near the convention center instead of a guest room I no longer trusted. The National Structural Engineers Symposium filled a ballroom with nearly 600 people, engineers from every corner of the country. On the second evening, James Kumar stood at a podium under stage lighting and told a room full of strangers about a drafting table by a window in downtown Atlanta in 2002. About a boss who never once let sloppy work slide. About how everything he'd built in 20 years traced directly back to 2 years of patient instruction from a man he was proud to call his mentor. Then he called my name and I walked up onto that stage in front of 600 people I'd never met. And James Kumar, 44 years old, founder of a firm with 84 employees, shook my hand like I was the most important person in that entire building. Afterward at dinner, he offered me something I hadn't expected. A standing role as senior consultant on Kumar Structural Solutions' most complex projects. Part-time. My own schedule. Work I could do from Atlanta most months and fly out for the rest. Not out of charity. He was very clear about that. Almost stern about it, the way I used to be stern with him at that drafting table. "I need your eye on things, David," he said. "I've got sharp young engineers, but nobody in this firm has caught a hairline problem in a load path the way you used to catch them. I want that back in the building." I said yes, before he'd even finished the sentence. I still hear from Rebecca occasionally. A Christmas card last year. A birthday call this spring that lasted 11 minutes and felt more honest than anything she'd said to me in the 2 years before that. Daniel's lawsuit settled out of court in January for an amount I'm told nearly wiped out the company. Ashford Properties quietly dissolved sometime around March. I don't know the details of how they're managing now, and I've made my peace with not knowing because that's not my house to keep propping up anymore. I built enough houses that stood on their own during my career to understand the difference between a foundation and a favor. Frank still comes over most Friday nights with 2 beers and Patricia's pecan pie, and we sit on that same back porch and talk about nothing important, which after everything has come to feel like the most important thing there is. James and I talk most weeks now about steel connections and seismic retrofits, and sometimes about nothing work-related at all. And every Sunday evening at 7, my phone rings, and it's Claire, usually somewhere between a math problem and a story about her robotics team. And I sit in my kitchen on Paces Ferry Road, and I listen to every single word of it, because I finally understand something it took 67 years and one very hot curb in Dallas to teach me. Love that only shows up when it needs something from you was never love in the first place. It was a transaction wearing love's clothing. And I wore those clothes for a long time without noticing the fit was wrong. But the people who show up for no reason at all, who explain gear ratios to you by flashlight, who call because they want to, and not because they need something signed, those are the ones you build your foundation around. Those are the ones worth every beam. I think about that afternoon at Dallas Love Field sometimes, standing there holding a stranger's blazer, sweating through my shirt, genuinely believing for about 45 minutes that I had been left with nothing at all. I hadn't been left with nothing. I'd been left standing exactly where I needed to be standing at exactly the right moment for someone who actually remembered my name to walk straight toward me and remind me what it felt like to matter to somebody for the right reasons. Sometimes the worst moment of your life is just the universe clearing a curb so somebody better can pull up to it. Here's what I want to ask you before you go. If you've made it this far with me, thank you genuinely. But more than that, I want to know, are you the David in this story? Or are you the James? Or are you the Claire? Are you the one being used? The one who remembers people for the right reasons? Or the one who shows up consistently without being asked? And I want you to sit with that question for a minute, because the answer might change something about how you approach the relationships in your life. Comment down below and tell me which one resonates with you. 1 for the David, 2 for the James, 3 for the Claire. And tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there, because I genuinely want to know who's hearing this story right now. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because we've got a lot more stories like this one coming, and I promise you, every single one of them is going to make you think differently about who you're letting borrow your foundation. I'll see you on the next one. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Atlanta, Georgia to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.